HOA cut my power at 2 a.m. Their plan backfired. I bought a lakefront lot sitting 1 foot outside the HOA line, and the moment I drove the first stake, they came at me with lawyers, fake inspectors, and a scheme they thought I'd never uncover. I didn't bend. I dug in, followed the paperwork, and watched their whole plan collapse under the weight of their own lies. If you're standing your ground too, drop a comment and stick around. I've got more real stories coming that'll make every HOA think twice. The morning I broke ground on my lakefront lot in northern Montana, the world felt quiet enough to hear the wind pulling through the tall pines. You could smell sawdust just from opening the tailgate. Clean, sharp, familiar. The lake sat still as poured glass, reflecting the ridgeline in a way that made you forget trouble existed anywhere beyond these slopes. After 20 years designing bridges for other people, this was the first structure I intended to build purely for myself. A cabin with my own hands, my own plans, on land I'd studied, measured, and defended down to the last inch. That inch mattered more than I realized. My boots pressed fresh marks into the frost-soft dirt as I walked the property line again, dragging a tape measure the same way I had during my surveyor years. Slow, deliberate, double-checking where the county map and the physical markers matched. The Lakeshore HOA boundary ran in a clean curve behind a cluster of birches on the west side. My lot sat just outside that curve. Not yards, not feet, 1 single foot. Enough to keep every HOA rule, fee, and restriction off my back. I'd bought this lot for that exact reason. I set out the first footing stakes with a small rubber mallet, marking the corners that would anchor my cabin to the earth. The sounds were soft, almost satisfying. The little thud of the mallet, the breath of wind turning over a leaf, the ripple of water against the rocky bank. Everything matched the picture in my head. Peace, solitude, a future home with cedar siding and a wood stove burning through winter. Then dust rose on the road. I paused and looked over my shoulder just in time to see a beige SUV bouncing toward me on the uneven gravel. The vehicle's nose dipped, then jerked as if the driver stabbed the brakes too hard. The engine idled high, restless, before the door swung open and a woman in a sharp maroon coat stepped out like she'd been rehearsing it. Linda Farnell, Lakeshore HOA president. I recognized her from the pamphlets tacked around the local post office. Tight smile, pale hair tied back, posture stiff enough to snap. Up close, she was exactly the same, except her expression now was colder than the lake in February. "You can't build there," she barked, starting across the gravel with the certainty of someone who'd spent her entire life correcting other people. Her boots kicked dust at my tool bag as she walked. "This is shoreline jurisdiction." I leaned one hand on the shovel and adjusted the brim of my hat against the morning glare. "Ma'am, this is private property. I pulled my permits and the county signed off." She didn't even pretend to look. "Lakeshore HOA regulations apply to all visible structures along the lakefront. That includes your cabin." I exhaled slowly. That word, regulations, had a way of flattening joy quicker than anything else. But I kept my voice even, calm, like I was talking to a client who'd misunderstood a blueprint. "Your boundary line ends 1 foot behind those birches." I pointed. "This isn't HOA land." "That's not how shoreline jurisdiction works," she snapped, folding her arms like she was trying to hold the lake in place by sheer will. "The community maintains visual harmony across all shared water features." "That sounds made up," I said quietly. Her jaw tightened. She pulled a stack of papers from her coat. HOA letterheads, diagrams, clauses. Most didn't apply, and she knew it. But it wasn't about the rules. It was about control. I reached into my truck, grabbed the folded county zoning map, and unfurled it across the hood so the wind slapped one corner like it was trying to draw attention. A thick red line curved around the lake, the official boundary. A blue dot marked my parcel, 1 foot outside. See this? I tapped the print. Your HOA ends here. I'm over here. My land, my build. For a moment, she just stood there staring at the map like it offended her personally. Her cheeks reddened, a slow flush climbing her neck. She folded her papers back up sharply, each movement clipped and defensive. Well, she hissed, then our lawyers will handle you. She spun so quickly that her coat snapped behind her like a sail catching wind. Her SUV threw dust across my lumber pile as she peeled out, gravel pinging against the fender of my truck. The lake went quiet again, but the silence felt different now, uneasy, waiting. I picked up my mallet, squared my shoulders, and drove the next footing stake into the earth. The metal rang a little sharper this time. If she was fighting over land she didn't own, then something deeper was going on, something she didn't want me to see. And I intended to find out exactly what. 3 days later, the quiet rhythm of early morning work was broken before I'd even stepped out of my truck. The sun was barely cresting over the ridge, painting the lake in soft gold, when I saw a shape standing upright in the middle of my dirt driveway. Not a person. Worse. A sign. A bright white violation notice staked into the ground like a warning marker on a battlefield. The Lakeshore HOA crest sat at the top in heavy blue ink, too official-looking for something that had no legal right to be there. Beneath it were bulleted infractions: unauthorized construction, environmental disruption, failure to comply with shoreline aesthetic guidelines. A neat little threat list made to intimidate new homeowners into obedience. But I wasn't new, and I sure wasn't theirs. I stepped closer, boots crunching through the frost. Whoever planted it had done so with care, hammering the stake deep enough that the earth still clung around its edges. It wasn't thrown together. It was deliberate. Someone took their time trespassing on my land. My jaw tightened, but I kept my breathing slow. No sense letting anger take the wheel before the day even started. Instead, I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and snapped photos. The sign, the ground disturbance, the angle from the road, the fresh tire tracks in the gravel leading back toward the HOA neighborhood. Documentation. My old engineering supervisor used to say, "Truth without evidence is just a story. Evidence makes truth unshakable." I wasn't going to war with emotion. I was going to war with proof. I plucked the stake out of the dirt with one firm yank. A little shower of loose soil scattered across my boots. The sign went under my arm like any other scrap piece of lumber as I walked toward the cabin frame. I set it against the skeleton of the east wall, right next to the stud where morning light poured through. If they wanted to leave me messages, I'd leave the evidence where it belonged, in plain sight. I dialed the county building office. A voice answered on the third ring, warm and familiar. "Building compliance, this is Dave." "Morning, Dave, it's Cole Haverford." "Oh, hey, Cole. Cabin coming along?" "It was," I said, until the HOA decided to start playing sheriff. A rustle of papers, then a sigh. "What happened?" I told him everything. Finding the sign, the bogus list of violations, the fact that it was planted at least 100 feet outside their own jurisdiction. I could almost hear him shaking his head. "You're outside their authority," he said. "They can't issue notices on private parcels not deeded to the HOA." "They can't," I repeated, "but they did." That got his attention. "All right, I'll file an incident report. That crosses into impersonating a municipal authority." I heard keys clicking on his end. "I'll send a copy to the county attorney. They'll want to keep an eye on this." "Appreciate it. Stay sharp out there, Cole. They're persistent." Persistent was one word for it. The day carried on with the rhythm I'd hoped for, measuring joists, lifting beams into place, the smell of fresh lumber settling into the cold air. By late afternoon, the cabin's frame rose taller than before, and the structure had begun to look like more than just an idea. It had edges, weight, a presence. But something didn't feel right. A shifting in the air, like a storm building behind mountain peaks. I set down my hammer and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No animals, no wind. Just stillness. Too clean and too empty. By the time dusk settled in, turning the lake into a sheet of steel, I packed up my tools and locked the generator cage. The sky darkened early up here, and night dropped fast between the pines. I climbed into my truck, headlights cutting a narrow path along the gravel as I drove home. Around 9, as I sat at the small kitchen table in my rental house overlooking the valley, my trail cam app pinged. Motion detected. Front gate, 20 seconds ago. My chest tightened. I tapped the alert and watched as the footage loaded, a grainy night vision image at first, then clearer once the camera adjusted. A man walked into the frame, hood pulled low. He held a laminated sheet in his hand. He looked around once, twice, then bent down and planted something into the dirt. When he stood again, the reflective top of another HOA notice caught the moonlight. He didn't hurry. This wasn't a prankster. This was someone carrying out an assignment. The man walked back toward the road and disappeared. But the camera caught his build, his posture, the way he favored his right leg like there was stiffness in the left. I didn't know his name yet, but I'd recognize that frame again. I played the clip twice more, letting the details etch themselves into my memory. Then I stood, grabbed my notebook, and began writing. Date, time, description, evidence. My handwriting stayed steady. This wasn't about a notice. This was about intimidation. And intimidation meant one thing. They weren't done. I set the pen down and glanced out the window. The valley was dark, but in the far distance, faint lights flickered along the HOA-controlled lakeshore like a row of watchful eyes. "Who are you working for?" I murmured into the quiet. The answer was obvious. Linda wasn't acting alone. And whoever she'd sent to post those signs wasn't stopping until they believed they'd pushed me off my own land. They were mistaken. By the next morning, the frost had thinned and the early light spilled across the lake like someone had poured silver into the basin. I pulled into the driveway and noticed, with a tightening in my chest, fresh tire tracks cutting across the soft earth. Not the ones from last night. Different tread marks. Fresher, deeper. They hadn't wasted any time. I set down my thermos on the tailgate and listened. Nothing but the creak of pine branches shifting and the quiet lapping of water on the rocks. Still, the air had the feeling of having been disturbed. You could sense when someone had been somewhere they shouldn't. I unloaded my tools and started setting up to finish the cabin's east wall framing. But not even an hour passed before I heard engines again. This time 2 of them, rolling up the gravel with slow, deliberate caution. Not the angry, dust-kicking arrival Linda favored. This was different, controlled, measured, almost official sounding. 2 white SUVs eased into view. Both had magnetic signs slapped onto the doors. Lakeshore Compliance Division. Below that, a tagline, maintaining excellence since 1994. The logos were clean and polished. The authority behind them? Completely imaginary. The drivers stepped out in near-perfect sync. 2 men, early 40s maybe, wearing matching navy polos tucked tight into khaki pants, clipboards in hand, sunglasses reflective enough to catch the shape of my half-built cabin behind them. One cleared his throat. "Sir, we're here to conduct a shoreline compliance inspection." I wiped sawdust from my gloves. "You're trespassing." The taller one stepped forward, posture stiff. "We have the right to review all lakeside development that impacts the community's visual and environmental assets." I let out a slow breath through my nose. "You're quoting the wrong book. That rule applies only to parcels within the Lakeshore HOA boundary. This lot isn't one of them. Clipboard man number 2 adjusted his sunglasses. That's debatable. The association is in the process of reviewing extension clauses for shoreline protection. Extension clauses don't override deeds, I cut in. And they sure don't override county zoning law. They exchanged a look. Not fear, not surprise. Annoyance. Like I'd interrupted a routine script they'd used on other homeowners. I walked to my truck, grabbed the rolled county map I'd laminated for weatherproofing, and spread it across my tailgate. The wind nudged the edges, but the bold red HOA boundary line held clear and undeniable. Here, I said, tapping the map. Your border ends 1 foot behind those birches. The property you're standing on is mine, completely outside your purview. The shorter man shifted his weight, scuffing the dirt with his shoe. The HOA doesn't recognize that interpretation. I barked a humorless laugh. You don't get to recognize or not recognize county surveys. They exist whether you like them or not. Silence. Even the lake seemed to pause, waiting. I reached into the cab of my truck and pulled out a fresh, crisp folder I'd assembled the night before. County codes printed, highlighted, tagged with sticky notes. I'd stayed up past midnight reading statutes I hadn't looked at since my engineering days, making sure I was armed with more than instinct. I held out the folder. Read this before you come back. Or better yet, don't come back at all. Neither man reached for it. From the ridge above the tree line, I heard boots crunching on gravel. I turned to see Nora Deegan making her way down the slope, carrying a box of bolts I'd ordered through her sawmill. Her auburn braid swung behind her like a rope in the wind, and she walked with the relaxed confidence of someone used to hauling lumber for a living. She took one look at the 2 men and stopped short. What's this circus? Compliance inspection, the tall one said stiffly. On his land? Nora snorted. You've got to be kidding. You boys even know whose driveway you're standing in? They stiffened, but said nothing. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice. Cole, these are the same types who roughed up the Petersons last year. HOA bullied them with fake fines until they sold their house for pennies. I frowned. I thought the Petersons moved voluntarily. That's what the HOA said, but nobody leaves a lake house voluntarily when the mortgage is paid off. She shook her head. You're poking a nest, Cole. They don't like losing. The taller man snapped his clipboard shut. This conversation is no longer productive. We'll be filing a report with... You'll be filing nothing, Nora cut in sharply. Unless it's a trespass apology. The 2 men retreated toward their SUVs with stiff spines and clenched jaws. Engines started up. Gravel spit behind the tires, and they pulled away in a practiced formation. When the sound faded, I finally let my shoulders drop. Nora rested her boot against a rock. They're not just testing you, they're measuring you. For what? To see how hard they'll need to push to make you break. She handed me the box of bolts. Don't let 'em. As she hiked back up the ridge, I stood there with the morning wind brushing against the half-built walls of my cabin. The structure looked more fragile than it had earlier, almost like it was bracing itself for what was coming. I walked back inside the frame and ran my hand along one of the vertical studs. The wood was firm, straight, dependable, everything the HOA wasn't. They'd tried intimidation. They'd tried impersonating authority. Now they were testing boundaries, both physical and legal. I stepped out onto the dirt again and stared at the birch line marking that one crucial foot of separation. What will they try once intimidation fails? I murmured. Because I already knew the answer. Something worse. Something quieter. Something done in the dark where they assumed no one was watching. They were mistaken about that too. 2 nights passed without incident, though the quiet felt manufactured. Too smooth, too careful, like the lake itself was waiting for the next ripple. I kept working during the day, framing out the second wall, raising beams with the slow precision of a man who knew, he'd have to defend every inch of them. By the time the sun slid behind the ridge on the third evening, the cabin had grown bones, clean-cut timber rising against the sky, a future structure staking its claim on the land. But as darkness took the shoreline, I felt something shift. The air grew still, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that falls before a storm. Even the loons across the lake sounded hesitant, their calls shorter, uneasy. I packed my tools, locked the generator cage twice, and placed the trail cams so they covered the entire perimeter, road, tree line, and the narrow stretch where the temporary power box mounted beside a stack of lumber. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the faint buzz of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. Motion detected. Rear post camera. Timestamp, 2:14 a.m. I sat up instantly, the cold of the room sharper than usual. Another alert followed. Motion detected. Generator perimeter. Timestamp, 2:16 a.m. The last alert came 12 seconds later. Power fluctuation detected. Generator offline. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I threw on my coat, grabbed my keys, and was in my truck within seconds, tires gripping the frosted gravel as I headed toward the lot. The headlights cut through the darkness, bouncing off trees and throwing long shadows across the ground. As I turned onto the access road, the cold wind dragged at the branches, and the lake below glimmered faintly under the rising moon. I pulled up to the cabin site and immediately saw it. The generator was dead, a dark, lifeless block of steel. Cords lay limp on the ground, their ends hacked clean. I knelt and held one of the severed cables up to the light. The cut was angled, rough, done with something sharp but not precise. Whoever did it wasn't just trying to disable power. They wanted to send a message. My phone buzzed again. Trail cam footage uploaded. I tapped the thumbnail and watched the night vision clip load. A lone figure moved into frame. Hood up, shoulders hunched, limping slightly on the left side. He crouched next to the generator box, pulled out a tool, and worked furiously. In less than 20 seconds, he severed the main cable, froze when the camera flickered, then hurried back toward the woods. I replayed the footage, focusing on the gate. That limp. I'd seen it before. Deputy Mason Reddick confirmed it the next morning when we met at the sheriff's office. He leaned over my phone, squinting with a practiced eye. "That's Mark Weller," he said. "Maintenance committee for Lakeshore HOA. Messed up his knee in a snowmobile crash 2 winters back. Hard to mistake that walk." I folded my arms. "Cutting a power line to a construction site. That's not a prank." "No," he agreed. "That's vandalism. And a safety hazard. Could have caused a fire." He shook his head. "This isn't HOA business anymore. This is criminal." Reddick filed the report and forwarded the footage to the county prosecutor. Then he looked at me in that steady, quiet way only men who've worked long hours on back roads tend to look. "They're poking you harder than they poke most folks," he said. "You know why?" "I have a feeling," I said. "But not the whole picture." "You will?" He pushed the printed report across the desk. "Because people who get this bold, they usually make bigger mistakes." He was right. By the afternoon, the entire Lakeshore HOA board had gathered for one of their weekly strategy meetings in a barn-like community center overlooking the lake. Sheriff's deputies rolled in 2 cruisers deep and walked straight into the building. I stood far enough away not to intrude but close enough to watch. Voices erupted inside, shouting, deflecting, somebody slamming something on a table. When the deputies reappeared, Mark Weller was between them, wrists bound, face redder than the cold wind warranted. He avoided my eyes as they escorted him out, but guilt hung on him like wet clothes. A few HOA members standing near the doors whispered as he passed. One of them, an older man, looked at me with something like regret, or maybe fear. It was hard to tell from that distance. Weller climbed into the cruiser without resistance. The door shut with a soft, heavy click, one that sounded like more than metal latching. It sounded like escalation. I turned back toward my cabin site, the wind kicking up dust and dry pine needles as I walked. My boots crunched rhythmically against the gravel. The lake shimmered with the early afternoon light, calm in a way that felt almost mocking, nature oblivious to the nonsense men stirred up around it. If a foot soldier like Weller was willing to risk a felony, then Linda wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was directing a campaign. Coordinated. Calculated. Dangerous in its persistence. The question wasn't why she wanted control anymore. The real question was, what was she hiding that made my inch of land worth breaking the law for? I stopped at the edge of my lot and looked toward the birches marking that invisible, crucial boundary. Whatever secret sat on the other side of that line, Linda was betting her entire HOA power structure on keeping it buried. She was about to lose that bet. The morning after Weller's arrest, the lake wore a thin mist, drifting low across the water like breath on a cold mirror. I stood at the edge of my lot, coffee steaming into the chill air, watching ripples cross the surface. Something in them felt symbolic. Whatever was happening beneath, I couldn't ignore it anymore. If Linda was willing to send a man to commit a felony just to stall my cabin, she wasn't protecting aesthetics. She was protecting something worse. I drove into town and parked outside a small brick office wedged between the hardware store and an insurance agency. The glass door read, Avery Knox, attorney at law property, zoning, and land rights. Avery was sharp, early 40s, focused eyes, quick mind. She'd left a high-paying career in Missoula to start her own rural practice, fed up with big city firms ignoring everyday landowners. When I showed her the printed trail cam footage and the reports from Deputy Reddick, her eyebrows shot up. "They sent a man to cut your power line?" she asked, voice low but incredulous. "That's not HOA harassment. That's conspiracy." "Why? What are they trying to gain?" Avery pulled my county parcel map closer, tracing the boundary line with her pen. "The HOA's authority ends here, and you're building here. 1 foot on the safe side." "Exactly why I bought it," she nodded. "So what does Lakeshore HOA gain by claiming you're inside theirs?" "That's what I need to find out." Avery leaned back in her chair. "Then we start digging." For the next 2 hours, she combed through county public records with an intensity only seasoned attorneys and puzzle solvers possess. The tap of her keyboard filled the quiet office as laminated maps and printed documents spread across her desk like a paper storm. Then she froze. "Cole," she said, sliding a form toward me. "Take a look." I scanned the header. Petition for Environmental Impact Review. Lakeshore Section 7 Expansion. The filing date was 6 weeks ago. The description listed undeveloped shoreline parcels adjacent to the Lakeshore HOA boundary, subject to community oversight due to environmental sensitivity. My lot. Every detail matched my land. Acreage, shoreline length, topography, even the nearby birch cluster. "Expansion?" I muttered. "I thought HOAs couldn't just change their borders." "They can't," Avery said. "Not legally, which means this filing shouldn't exist." She clicked another window open. "And look at who submitted it." I leaned in. Applicant. Clearwater Conservation Coalition Registered Agent, Douglas Farnell. I blinked. Farnell. "Linda's cousin," Avery confirmed. "He's been using this nonprofit to pressure the county into adopting stricter shoreline regulations." "What nonprofit? I've never heard of it." "You're not supposed to." She tapped the screen. "It's brand new, registered 5 months ago. No board members listed except Douglas. No activity reports. Just a pretty logo and a mission statement that sounds pulled from an HOA brochure." A chill crawled across the back of my neck. So the HOA created a fake environmental coalition to push for rule changes that would give them control over my lot. And probably others, Avery said. This isn't about protecting wildlife. This is about expanding authority. I felt my jaw tighten. And if the county buys it, they get jurisdiction. Exactly. She opened another file, public email correspondence between county officials and petitioning organizations. Most were standard procedural notes, but one thread, buried halfway down the page, caught my eye. From county.assessor@montanacounty.gov to clearwatercoalition@gmail.com. Subject: Re-proposed shoreline review zones. The email body contained a single line. Your requested adjustments are feasible. We'll flag parcels for classification review. Avery zoomed in. This means someone in the assessor's office is cooperating. Maybe willingly, maybe not. But someone is helping them manipulate land classification. I rubbed a hand across my face. So now they're messing with county records. Or trying to, she said. Nothing's final yet. But if we hadn't caught this now, they could have reclassified my property and claimed jurisdiction. Avery nodded slowly. And once that happens, reversing it is a nightmare. A heaviness settled in my chest. Not fear, not anger. Resolve. What's the next step? I asked. We file a public records request, she said. Full email chain, communications logs, petitions, drafts, everything they've touched. If they're coordinating, we'll find the threads. And then? She leaned forward, eyes narrowing with determination. Then we pull the whole sweater apart. I left her office with a thick folder of documents tucked under my arm and the wind cutting across the street, lifting flakes of dust from the roadside. When I reached my truck, I stopped. Across the lake, half hidden behind a row of pines, I could see the top of the Lakeshore Community Center. Clean, polished, expensive. A building that looked like it belonged in a brochure. But right now, it looked more like the headquarters of a quiet war. As I drove back toward my lot, the clouds thickened over the mountains, casting long shadows across the water. The cabin frame stood tall against the sky, beams stark against the gathering gray. I parked, stepped out, and set the folder on the hood of my truck. The wind flipped the top page open, back to the environmental petition, the fake nonprofit logo staring up at me like a smirk. Somebody inside that HOA believed they could change the rules by bending county procedures behind closed doors. They believed wrong. I lifted the folder, tapped it twice against the hood, and whispered to the wind, "You wanted a fight, Linda? You're about to get one." And for the first time since the HOA had stepped onto my land, the lake didn't feel uneasy. It felt ready. By the next morning, the clouds had rolled low over the ridge, sitting heavy like they were thinking about dropping snow. The air held that brittle stillness you only get in Montana right before winter decides to show teeth. I walked the perimeter of my lot with the same slow, deliberate steps I'd used during my engineering days surveying bridge sites, checking for new disturbances in the dirt, broken branches, anything out of place. Nothing. To nothing. It was the kind of calm that meant someone had changed tactics. I got back to the cabin frame and was tightening a row of joist hangers when a white sedan I didn't recognize pulled onto the gravel. It wasn't HOA. Too plain, too government issue. The driver got out, expression polite but unreadable, and handed me a sealed envelope. "Delivery for Mr. Haverford," he said, offering a quick nod before turning back to his car. No signature required. No explanation. Just a white envelope thick with bad news. I tore the seal open with a thumb. Inside was a single-page letter printed in unremarkable county formatting. Simple font. No highlighted warnings. No bolded threats. But the words might as well have been written in red ink. Notification of temporary reclassification parcel 14B MT 2117. Designation, recreational use with shared community oversight, pending further review. My stomach dropped. Shared community oversight. That phrase didn't exist anywhere in the county bylaws. Not in any of the environmental sections, not in the zoning tables. It was new, invented, or slipped in through back channels where public eyes didn't normally wander. I read it again, slower this time, feeling each word sink like cold water down my spine. This temporary reclassification would give the HOA exactly what they wanted: a legal foothold, the ability to claim regulatory involvement, grounds to intervene, grounds to delay, grounds to weaponize that 1-foot boundary line I'd relied on like bedrock. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was bureaucratic warfare. A crunch of gravel pulled my attention up. Nora's truck swung into the drive, bed loaded with a stack of reclaimed hardwood I'd ordered. She hopped out, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Got your planks, weather-stained pine just like you wanted." Her smile faded when she saw the look on my face. "What happened?" I handed her the letter. She scanned it once and then again, her lips tightening with each line. "Shared community oversight?" she muttered. "That's not a real classification." "It is now," I said. Nora let out a low whistle. "They're playing dirty." Dirtier than I expected. I folded the letter. "Someone inside the county office is helping them. Has to be." She leaned against the truck, crossing her arms. "You think this ties back to that Clearwater Coalition nonsense Avery found?" "I'd bet the cabin on it." She shook her head slowly. "Cole, this isn't just an HOA scuffle. This is influence. Money. Somebody wants the Lakeshore HOA to control more land than they legally should." "And my lot is step 1, I said. The wind picked up, dragging loose wood shavings across the ground. They tumbled like little warning flags along the dirt. "Look," Nora said softly. "I know these people. They don't stop. They just change methods. You push back, they push harder. You call the sheriff, they call a committee. If they dragged the county into this, it means Linda has someone pulling strings for her." My jaw tightened. "But strings leave fingerprints." I drove straight to Avery's office, the letter lying on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. When I walked in, she took one look at my expression and said, "Tell me." I handed her the paper. She read it slowly, eyebrows drawing together with each word. "Oh, they're bold," she whispered. "Very bold." "Can they do this?" I asked. "No," she said immediately, "but they're trying to make it look like they can." "Why now?" "Because your lot is the keystone," she said, turning to her computer. "If they can force reclassification on you, they can claim authority over the entire South Shoreline. That means dues, that means fines, that means control." She clicked rapidly through databases until a document loaded, meeting minutes from last month's County Land Use Committee. "There," she said, pointing at the bottom, "buried in the discussion about wildlife corridors." I read the line aloud. "Submitted by Clearwater Conservation Coalition. Recommendation to review overlooked shoreline parcels for shared community impact." My fist curled. "That coalition is fake," I said. "They don't care," Avery replied. "All they need is a single county staffer willing to forward their paperwork, and they can slip their language into a hearing packet unnoticed." "And someone did," I said. "Assessor's office." She nodded. "The question now is who?" A heavy silence settled between us, broken only by the tapping of Avery's fingers against the desktop. Finally, she spoke. "We need every email between the assessor's office and Clearwater Coalition, every draft, every attachment, every timestamp. If they coordinated, we'll find the trail. And if we do..." Avery leaned back, eyes hard. "Then we stop the reclassification before it sticks, and we take the HOA down with it." I stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, the sky darkening over the ridge. The lake, faintly visible through the trees, rippled as if bracing for the storm we both knew was coming. My cabin frame stood firm against the wind, wood creaking like bones settling into place. I lifted the letter again, letting the breeze tug at its edges. "How deep does the conspiracy go?" I murmured. The lake didn't answer, but the silence around it felt like a promise that whatever lay beneath this mess, I was getting close. Too close for Linda's comfort. Too close for Linda's comfort. And that meant the real fight had only just begun. 2 days after the reclassification letter arrived, the weather turned sharp. A thin frost coated the pine needles, and the lake's surface shimmered with that dark metallic stillness that always hinted at snow in the Montana high country. I spent the morning reinforcing the cabin's temporary bracing, driving nails through cold lumber while the wind curled around the beams like a living thing. Around noon, Avery called. "Cole," she said without preamble, her voice clipped with urgency. "The subpoena came through. We have access." "To what?" "To the HOA's internal communications." A slow, controlled breath left my lungs. "And?" "I need you in my office, now." I wiped my hands, threw on my coat, and drove into town. As I pushed open the glass door, Avery already had a file laid out on her desk. Thick, bound, highlighted in more colors than I knew she owned. She didn't speak. She tapped the stack once and I sat. "Start here," she said. The first email was from Linda to her board, time-stamped 3 months earlier, far before my permits were finalized. "The new parcel on the South Ridge threatens our property value continuity. We need to create pressure points early to deter development." Pressure points. That phrase hit like a fist made of ice. I flipped the page. Another email. "If he refuses oversight, we escalate. Non-binding citations, environmental concerns, access obstruction. He'll abandon eventually." My jaw tightened so hard I felt the muscle twitch. The next email was even worse. "Clearwater Coalition will file the petition. County contact says he'll flag the parcel quietly once we provide impact language. Keep details internal." County contact. Quiet flag. Impact language. They weren't just manipulating paperwork, they were coordinating it. Then came the email that made my stomach twist. From Mark Weller to HOA Board Internal List. Subject: Generator issue. "I'll take care of the generator tonight. Won't be a problem after that." There it was. A written admission of sabotage. A plan. A timestamp. A man following orders. I sat back in the chair, letting the air settle. The fluorescent light above us hummed faintly. Outside, cars rolled down Main Street, unaware that an entire HOA conspiracy was unfolding inside a small law office. Avery watched my reaction, arms crossed. "This isn't just harassment, Cole. This is criminal conspiracy. Coordinated. Documented." I forced out words through clenched teeth. "They planned all of this before I even bought the lot." "And that's their mistake," she said, leaning forward. "Conspiracy laws don't care about intentions. They care about actions. And Weller's arrest ties everything together." I rubbed a hand across my face. "What's our next move?" "We take this to Judge Callahan," Avery said. "Not a hearing. A motion for injunction, discovery extension, and referral to the district attorney. The emails prove coordination and malicious intent." "And the reclassification?" Avery lifted another page. An internal HOA thread showing board members congratulating themselves after Douglas submitted his fake environmental petition. "They didn't expect anyone to request these records," she said. "They thought they were operating in the dark." "But the trail cams," I murmured. "The emails, the petition. Everything leads back to them." Avery closed the folder firmly. "This will not survive a judge's scrutiny." Outside the office, the wind swept down the street, lifting dust and stray leaves into a twisting little cyclone that spun through the parking lot. I stepped out, the cold biting sharper now, like the air itself reacted to the weight of what we'd uncovered. Before heading back to the lake, I stopped at the sheriff's office to show Reddick what Avery had found. He scanned the printed emails slowly, jaw working back and forth. "They put this in writing?" he muttered. "What kind of fools do that?" "Arrogant ones," I said quietly. He shook his head. "You bring this to Callahan, she'll lose it. She hates when local boards pretend they're government." "I know," I said. "That's why this is going to hit them hard." When I returned to my lot, the light was fading. The cabin frame stood tall against the dusk, beams catching the amber glow from the sinking sun. I walked up the slope, set my tools down, and just stood there a moment, listening to the lake steady and unshaken, as if waiting for the storm to crest. For the first time, the weight of the fight felt different, not like harassment pressing in from all sides, but like justice leaning slowly, powerfully in my direction. They had planned pressure points. They had planned intimidation. They had planned sabotage. But what they hadn't planned for was documentation. And the moment Judge Callahan saw those emails, everything the HOA had built, the lies, the arrogance, the quiet manipulations, would crumble. I looked up at the ridge where the pines stood dark and silent, and whispered to the cold wind, "What will the judge say when she sees this?" The lake didn't answer. It didn't have to. The evidence would speak for itself. 3 days later, the sun rose behind a thin curtain of low clouds, turning the lake the color of burnished steel. I stood on my porchless cabin frame, sipping burnt coffee from a metal thermos, while the wind pushed sawdust across the ground in slow spirals. Today wasn't for building. Today was for court. Avery met me outside the county courthouse, a squat, sandstone building with a roof darkened by years of weather and pine smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. She wore a charcoal suit and held a leather binder thick enough to stop a stray bullet. "You ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." We walked through the double doors, the warm, dusty scent of old law books greeting us like a familiar warning. The hallway echoed with boot steps, mine and Avery's slow and measured, the HOA contingent's fast and nervous. Linda stood with her attorney at the far end, posture rigid, pale hair pulled tight as wire. She avoided my eyes, which told me everything. Guilt always looks away first. Inside courtroom 3B, Judge Ruth Callahan presided from the bench. She was a tall woman with a stern face softened only by the faintest hint of silver hair escaping her bun. Her reputation was well known across Montana, absolutely fair, absolutely unforgiving of arrogance. The clerk called our case. Petition for injunction and motion for referral. Haverford versus Lakeshore Homeowners Association. We stepped forward. So did Linda and her attorney. The wood-paneled room felt tighter than it should have, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Avery began. "Your Honor, our motion concerns coordinated harassment, falsified jurisdictional claims, attempted property annexation, and criminal sabotage." She placed the binder on the evidence table with a solid thump. "All supported by written communication." Linda's attorney rose, his voice as smooth as oiled gravel. "Your Honor, the HOA was merely enforcing aesthetic guidelines to maintain community values. Any misunderstandings were unintentional and—" "Unintentional?" Avery's voice cut through the air. "Then perhaps you can explain these." She flipped open the binder, sliding several papers toward the judge, printed emails, highlighted lines, timestamps. Judge Callahan picked up the first one and read silently. Then another. Her eyebrows lowered with each page. She looked up, expression sharpening. "Mrs. Farnell, approach." Linda hesitated. Her lawyer gave a stiff nod, and she shuffled to the bench. Judge Callahan held up a page. You instructed your board to create pressure points and stall construction by any necessary avenue. Did you write this? Linda opened her mouth, closed it, then forced out. It was taken out of context. The judge moved to another email. And this? Clearwater Coalition will provide language for extended shoreline oversight. Were you aware the coalition is registered to your cousin? Linda's face drained of color. They're an environmental group. Mrs. Farnell, the judge said, tone flattening. They have no documented activity, no board, and share a mailing address with your HOA meeting hall. A murmur rippled across the courtroom. Avery stepped forward again. And then there's Mr. Weller. She pulled up a printed still from my trail cam. Weller crouched by my generator, hood low, limp visible. This is the defendant's maintenance committee member committing sabotage. He admitted in custody he was acting on board directives. Linda's attorney sputtered. Your Honor, we deny any. Judge Callahan slammed her gavel once. The crack echoed like a rifle shot. This is not a zoning matter, she said, voice rising with controlled fire. This is a coordinated campaign of harassment, obstruction, and criminal tampering. She turned her full attention to Linda, who looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Your HOA has no authority over this man's property. None. Yet you acted as if you were a government body. Linda swallowed hard. We were trying to protect the community. No, the judge snapped. You were trying to expand your power. Silence fell heavy. Then Judge Callahan leaned back, eyes like steel. I am granting the injunction. Effective immediately, the Lakeshore HOA is prohibited from contacting, citing, fining, inspecting, or approaching Mr. Haverford's property in any capacity. She flipped another page in the binder. Furthermore, due to evidence of coordinated action and sabotage, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review under conspiracy statutes. Linda's attorney's face dropped as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. And, the judge added, I am ordering a temporary freeze on all discretionary funds within the HOA pending further audit. That was the moment it happened. The shift. The flip in power. Everything Linda had leveraged, fear, influence, intimidation, folded in a single gavel stroke. Avery exhaled long and slow. I felt something loosen in my chest, a pressure I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. As the courtroom emptied, HOA members whispered frantically, some avoiding Linda, others glaring at her. Word would spread fast through Lakeshore, faster than the cold wind blowing off the lake that afternoon. Outside, Avery clasped the binder shut. You did it, she said. This was the turning point. No, I said softly, watching clouds drift low over the pine-covered ridge. This was only the beginning. Because with every truth dragged into the light, someone else in that HOA was about to lose the shadow they'd been hiding in. How would the community react when the full story hit the news? I didn't know, but the lake, calm and reflective behind us, felt like it did. It felt ready for the next ripple. And that ripple came faster than anyone expected. 2 weeks after Judge Callahan froze the HOA's discretionary funds, winter settled properly across the ridge. Frost clung to every pine needle at sunrise, and the lake skimmed over with a thin crust of ice that crackled when the temperature shifted. I spent the early mornings sanding interior beams, the rhythmic scrape of paper against cedar echoing through the half-finished cabin. For the first time in months, there was peace. But peace never lasts long when corruption is cornered. Late on a Wednesday morning, as I was fitting the last roof panel into place, a county vehicle pulled up along my gravel drive. Not an unmarked sedan this time. The seal of the Montana Department of Public Integrity glinted on the side door. 2 investigators stepped out. One older, long coat, silver hair. The other younger, carrying a briefcase with reinforced corners. They introduced themselves simply as state review agents. They weren't here for me. We're looking into the financial practices of the Lakeshore HOA, the older one said. Specifically discretionary spending, consulting fees, and vendor contracts. I nodded. Judge Callahan's orders. Yes, he replied. And your case, it opened more doors than you think. They asked to review the HOA-related materials I had. Copies of emails, timestamps, the Clearwater Coalition filings Avery had uncovered. I led them to my truck and handed over a folder I'd prepared. They sifted through it, faces tightening as they read. This, the younger agent said, tapping a page, connects directly to a vendor audit we initiated last year. He looked at me. We think you're sitting on the thread that unravels the whole sweater. What kind of vendor? I asked. A landscaping contractor the HOA used for shoreline beautification and erosion control. Large sums, very little evidence of actual work performed. The cold wind picked up, scattering wood shavings across the dirt like tiny white feathers. Let me guess, I said. It's tied to the HOA president's family. The older agent nodded grimly. Douglas Farnell, registered manager. No real business address. No equipment loans. No employee records. My chest tightened. And they funneled money through it. We believe so, he said. But we need to confirm it. They stepped back toward their car. We'll be in touch. And just like that, the quiet morning had cracked open, revealing something much larger beneath. A week later, it all came to a head. Avery called just after sunrise. Her voice buzzed with an energy I'd never heard from her. Cole, turn on the local news. Now! I grabbed the remote. The morning broadcast flickered to life. The camera pointed at the Lakeshore HOA Community Center, its polished wooden sign covered in frost, blue and white police lights flashing softly in the background. A reporter stood bundled in a heavy coat, breath misting in front of her. An ongoing investigation has resulted in multiple arrests connected to the Lakeshore Homeowners Association. Authorities say new evidence has revealed a secondary ledger showing unreported payments totaling more than $180,000. My hand froze on the remote. The reporter continued. The funds appear to have been directed through a shell company managed by Douglas Farnell, cousin of HOA President Linda Farnell. Investigators allege the HOA used false environmental filings to justify expansion and to channel funds into fraudulent vendor contracts. The camera panned. 2 men in handcuffs were being escorted out. One I recognized as Douglas. The other, the HOA treasurer. But then, Linda stepped outside. Her face was pale, stiff as chiseled marble, her hands trembling as a pair of deputies approached. She wasn't handcuffed, not yet, but she wasn't allowed to walk freely either. Reporters swarmed her with questions. Mrs. Farnell, did you authorize the fake nonprofit? Did you instruct board members to sabotage private property? Were you aware of the illegal payments? Her lips moved, but the wind stole her words. Her eyes, sharp, cold, always calculating, were different now, hollow, unsteady, as if the ground she'd ruled for years had suddenly vanished beneath her feet. Avery's voice came back through the phone. The DA's office is filing charges, fraud, conspiracy, financial misconduct, and they've linked the Clearwater Coalition filing directly to her husband. Husband? I said. I thought it was her cousin. Both, Avery replied. Turns out they layered it. Douglas submitted filings. Her husband handled logistics. They looped half their family into this mess. Then Avery added, voice softening. Cole, this isn't just a win. This is a collapse. I stood at the window, the early sunlight cutting long shadows across the snow-dusted clearing. My half-finished cabin glowed faintly under the cold light, each beam and board standing steady like a testament to resisting pressure. And the HOA, once loud, invasive, relentless, was now unraveling faster than the ice melting on the lake at noon. 2 hours later, I drove into town for supplies. As I passed the lakeshore entrance, I saw clusters of residents gathered in small knots, talking quietly, Their faces held more confusion than anger, more disappointment than fear. A few nodded at me, not smiles, not waves, just quiet acknowledgments. The first crack in their leadership had become a fracture. By afternoon, Deputy Reddick pulled his truck next to mine at the hardware store. He climbed out, tugging his hat down against the wind. "Got news for you," he said. "The state's filing additional charges." "What kind?" "Racketeering." The word landed like a fallen beam. I stared at him. "An HOA? Racketeering?" "Apparently it's more common than folks like to admit," he said. "But yours, this might be one of the biggest cases this region's seen." He leaned against the truck, lowering his voice. "You didn't just defend your lot, Cole. You exposed a system." As high as he walked away, a strange mix of emotions churned inside me. Victory, disbelief, exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that only comes after months of fighting a battle you never wanted in the first place. On the drive back to the lake, snow began to fall, thin flakes drifting down like pieces of quiet settling over the valley. When I pulled up to my lot, the cabin stood tall against the ridge, wood darkened slightly by the damp, windows reflecting the pale sky. I stepped out of the truck, listening to the wind move through the pines. "What becomes of the lake community now?" I muttered to myself. Because the HOA that once ruled it with intimidation and hidden agendas was no longer intact, and the people who lived under its shadow? They were about to see what life looked like without the iron grip of a corrupt board. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold, but from the sudden realization. This wasn't just a chapter ending, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And every ripple the lake had held in its stillness was now turning into a wave. Within days, the lakeshore community transformed. The once manicured, self-important HOA board had crumbled like wet paper under the weight of its own schemes. Residents who'd once spoken through forced smiles now gathered in small, cautious circles, voices hushed, as if speaking too loudly might summon the ghosts of the old leadership. The snow deepened across the ridge, laying a soft blanket over the pines and muting every sound. The lake froze into a sheet of white opal, its surface so still it looked like glass set on the world's quietest table. It was the kind of quiet Montana only offers after a storm, a pause that feels earned. As the legal dust settled, I turned back to the thing that had started it all, my cabin. I spent the next month finishing it, beam by beam, board by board, nail by nail, until the skeletal frame became a home. Nora came by on weekends to help me sand the floors and install the hardwood she'd delivered. The scent of pine filled the space, mixing with the cold winter air drifting through open window frames. By the time we varnished the last stair rail, the place felt less like a project and more like a promise fulfilled. One night, while snowflakes drifted outside like falling stars, I sat for the first time in front of the cabin's new wood stove. The crackling fire illuminated the fresh cedar walls, casting warm, dancing shadows across the room. That's when my phone buzzed, a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Haverford." A tired voice spoke. "Mr. Haverford? This is Calvin Rhymes, the new interim president of the Lakeshore Association." I paused. "Interim president?" "Yes," he said with a weary exhale. "We're cleaning house, literally and figuratively. The board voted to remove 3 members this week. We dissolved the old committees, too." I nodded even though he couldn't see it. "That's a start." "We'd like—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "We'd like you to come to the next community meeting. Talk about what happened. Help us understand what needs to change." I leaned back in the chair, listening to the fire crackle. "I'm not part of Lakeshore," I said. "I know. That's why we need you." His honesty disarmed me. There was no smugness, no power play, just the sound of a man trying to patch a community torn apart from the inside. "I'll come," I said finally, "but I won't sugarcoat anything." "That's exactly why we're asking." The meeting took place a week later in the same building where Weller had been arrested, the Lakeshore Community Center. Snow clung to the roof, glowing orange under the exterior lights. Residents filed inside slowly, wearing coats sprinkled with frost, their faces lined with worry and hope in equal measure. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the front of the room. The murmurs quieted. The heaters hummed along the walls, blowing warm air into a space that had grown used to cold leadership. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told them the truth, every step of what the HOA had done. The fake notices, the impersonation of authority, the sabotage, the hidden emails, the Clearwater Coalition, the fraudulent vendor, the ledger, the family involvement, the arrests. Every page of Avery's evidence binder translated into words the community could feel. When I finished, silence fell hard. Then a slow clap started from the back. One person, then another. Soon the whole room echoed with applause, not loud, not triumphant, but grateful, a release they'd been waiting years for. I didn't stay for the rest. I stepped outside into the cold night air, letting the quiet settle back into my bones. On my walk to the truck, a woman in a faded hiking jacket stopped me at the door. She must have been in her 60s, gray hair tucked under a wool cap, eyes soft but steady. "You fought back," she said. "Most people don't." "I had time," I said, "and the receipts." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You made them wish they'd never found your name." She walked off before I could reply. Back at the cabin, I pulled a chair out onto the deck, now finished with strong beams and lined with fresh lumber. The lake stretched out below, half frozen, reflecting the moonlight in thin, shimmering patches. No threats, no notices, no headlights creeping in the night. Just peace earned, fought for, and finally mine. But the story wasn't done. A week later, a uniformed courier arrived at my door with a letter from the state auditor's office. The wind tugged at the envelope as I opened it. Due to evidence of systemic financial misconduct, Lakeshore HOA is placed under formal state oversight pending full audit. All discretionary spending accounts remain frozen. I didn't celebrate. I just let the words sink in. 2 days later, Avery called. "They found more," she said. "A second ledger. Over 200,000 laundered through inflated vendor contracts. And one of the vendors, Douglas's cousin, doesn't even have an office. Just an empty lot." "That fits the pattern," I said quietly. "The AG's office is opening a racketeering case." The wooden bench creaked as I sank onto it, staring at the white expanse of the lake. "All this," I murmured, "because they couldn't stand someone building a cabin they didn't control." "Power hates losing," she said, "especially when it's built on fraud." Weeks later, the county held an auction for the vacant lot tied to the fake landscaping company. No one wanted it. The community was sick of anything connected to the scandal. I bought it for a few $1,000s. Not because I needed more land, but because I wanted to make sure nobody ever used it for anything but good. I built a simple fishing spot. One bench, one trash can, a small wooden sign that read, "No dues, no rules, just respect." Families came on weekends, kids with tangled lines, grandfathers with old tackle boxes, new residents who finally felt like their lake belonged to them again. One morning, early summer sun glinting off the thawed water, I found an envelope slipped behind my cabin door. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. "We were wrong. You stood your ground. Thank you." Unsigned. I folded it once and placed it with my old deed papers, not for safekeeping, but to remember the simple truth it carried. Justice doesn't roar. Justice doesn't threaten. Justice settles, quietly. like the lake after a long storm. And standing there on my deck, watching the water ripple under the warm Montana wind, I realized something. The cabin hadn't just become my home. It had become the line, the 1 foot of land that proved even the biggest HOA couldn't outrun the truth. And the truth would always win, so long as someone was willing to fight for it. If you've ever had to stand your ground, drop a simple justice in the comments so folks know they're not alone out there. And if you want more stories about ordinary people holding the line with nothing but grit and the law on their side, go on and subscribe. I'd be glad to have you here for the next one.